Hey there. Welcome back to another episode of the Outsider Podcast. I'm your host, as always, Drew Landry. And folks, this is the best politics podcast and video that you're going to find west of I-35. I'm really excited to start a new year and start a new direction for the podcast. I've got a lot of great things in store for you here in 2026. I'm just, again, very excited to launch this, especially with video, so that you can actually see my facial expressions whenever I discuss something, read something here, because I'm always prepared. I always have something, to really read, and I'm not just, winging it over here. So I actually have preparation for you. So whenever I do that, you can actually see what my face is. And so I think that's kind of interesting. And I'm just excited for this new direction as to where we're heading with this. And so before I get started in all this, first let me just say to you, Happy New Year, to really timestamp the recording of this. And so I'm very glad to be celebrating a new year with you. And I'm hoping you're in, that you got very good plans for yourself, for your family, your career, all the goals that you might have and that you hope that you can achieve here in 2026. And so that said, this episode is going to look very much so at something that often gets discussed, all right, at this time of year. And folks, that's the anniversary of January 6th. And so that's going to take up a large portion of today's episode. Really just trying to give you a key perspective, all right, that really should be objective more so than subjective. Really bothers me when something that gets thrown into whole subjectivity that really should be objective. Now, some people want to call into question the whole concept of gravity. Is there really a moon out there? It's just, whatever. But that said, I will get into one other thing about one of my alma maters, and that's IU, Indiana University, and its football program. And so, again, just to timestamp when I'm recording this, IU football is still in the college football playoff. So, whenever you're hearing me talk about IU football, know that when this is being recorded, the team is still in the college football playoff. So, so if you listen to this, next month, and the whole thing's over, and you'll actually understand that that when I was discussing this, it was relevant at that time. So the key portion of today has to do with January 6th. And folks, look, we're entering into the 5th anniversary, or we're around the 5th anniversary of the attack that took place on the Capitol on that very sad day in American history. And so before we really get into a lot of these things, let me just explain to you why January 6th is even a thing. Why that day is even important and has any sort of significance whatsoever. It's significant. January 6th in and of itself is significant because of a federal law. It's called the Electoral Count Act of 1887. Of course, it's been changed since then because of the events that took place on January 6th of 2021. But when that day happened, we were under what's called the old rules. So that's what we're going to really look at here. And so here's what the Electoral Count Act of 1887 will do is that at that point what it did was that Congress would convene in a joint session that would be led by the vice president, the president of the Senate. And they're going to certify the vote of the Electoral College. All right, so here's a very basic civic lesson here. All right, I don't want to get too deep in the woods because I don't want to lose you in all these little, well, they're not little, but in all these details. Is that the Electoral College is the body that elects the president and the vice president. All right, to know why we have an Electoral College, you got to do some some history into that. Look at the Constitution. There's a lot of compromise in that. And so we throw in the 12th Amendment in all this because the 12th Amendment comes in after the election of 1800. Again, that's a key turning point in presidential elections where the 12th Amendment makes it to where the president and the vice president receive the same number of electoral votes, and you have to have a majority. And it's due to that the vice president and the presidential candidates can't be from the same state because it has to do with the Electoral College and the number of electors. And so there's some finality, some fine-tuning, specific details about the Electoral College that makes it very clear that the president and the vice president can't be from the same state. So let's understand how how this works here. Okay, let's get up from the weeds. Let's do a very basic look here. So we have the popular vote that's held on the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November. All right, so we have that day. And then about a month later, we have the Electoral College that will officially count the ballots. I'm sorry, that will officially cast their ballots, not count. That will officially cast their ballots according to the popular vote. All right. So if you're still with me here, there's a lot of states that utilize the Electoral College count, their Electoral College vote that's going to be based on the popular vote. All right. So most of the time, 48 states utilize this. It's called the winner-take-all aspect. The winner of the state's popular vote will receive all of its Electoral College votes. Right? It just makes things a little easier that way. Winner-take-all, whether or not it's truly representative of that state, that's a whole other conversation I don't want to get into. But winner-take-all makes it easy for states to just cast their Electoral College votes. All right, so the idea is that the winner of the popular vote of that state would then receive all of its Electoral College votes. The reasoning is because of who the electors are. So electors in the Electoral College, all right, they're decided at the state party convention. That's done in the summer. And so that's where you have, like in Texas, we have 40 electors. So in 2024, at the Republican Party state convention in Texas and the Democratic state convention in Texas, both sides had 40 electors. Who gets to cast the official ballot? Well, the party of the victor of the popular vote. All right. So since Trump won Texas in 2024, it would be the Republican electors to cast the official ballot, the official Electoral College vote for Texas in 2024. All right, my home state of Indiana has 11 electoral votes. So the Democrats had 11 electors. The Republicans had 11 electors. That's decided by the party of the victor of the popular vote. All right, that's usually how that's done. 48 states do it that way. States of Maine and Nebraska do it differently. All right, Maine and Nebraska have where if you win the state's popular vote, you get 2 electoral votes. And then the other portions of that are decided by popular vote in congressional districts. So Maine has 4 electoral votes. You win the state of Maine, you get 2. But therefore you have 2 congressional districts. You got to do the popular vote in there. So in 2024, in 2020, and in 2016, Trump got 1 electoral vote from Maine. So Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden, and Kamala Harris got 3 votes from Maine. Right? Interesting. Right? That's just how that operates. In Nebraska, it operates in the exact same way. They have 5 electoral votes. The Cornhusker state has 5 electoral votes. And you win the state of Nebraska, that's 2. and then you have an opportunity to sweep up the rest of the 3 by winning the popular vote in those congressional districts. So that's how that operates. All right. Okay, I just gave you like a more in depth of the Electoral College probably than what you asked for. So that said, when we look at how all that operates, how can they be different? Well, it's done by the state legislatures. They're the ones who get to make that up. All right, but again, just remember now, most states just want to get it over with and make it easier, so they just do winner take all. Now we know what we're talking about. So in early to mid-December, the Electoral College in all their respective states cast their Electoral College votes. They cast the official ballot that is going to elect the president and the vice president. States then have to keep those votes, keep those ballots, keep those certificates, whatever you want to call them, and then harbor them. And they will then send them later that month to Congress. That's what's called Safe Harbor Day. All right? So then when they get to Congress, and again, according to the Electoral College, the Electoral Count Act of 1887, Congress will then open up those certificates and will count them. All right? So seems pretty basic. So January 6th is that's the actual date. That's what it reads in the electoral count of 1887, and since the time that it's been amended, it actually reads as January 6th. So no matter where that day actually lands in the week, it could be a Sunday, it could be a Saturday, it could be a Thursday for all we know. It specifically reads January 6th. All right, so Congress will meet in that joint session led by the vice president, and they certify the Electoral College vote. All right. Honestly, it's straightforward. It's simple. It's boring. It's very administrative. Can there be objections? The answer is yes. There can be objections. According to the old rules, here's what you had to do. You had to put it in writing, and you had to have a member from the House and a senator to sign on to that, and then there would be a formal objection. If you did not have it in writing and you did not have a member from both chambers to sign on to it, then the objection would fail. Okay? So that objection process has been done a few times, since the 12th Amendment was ratified. It's been done in a handful of ways. But again, I just want to make it very clear to you, it can happen. The objection process doesn't always happen. All right. So all that they're meant to do in Congress on January 6th is just to count the Electoral College votes and certify them. Once they're done, the president of the Senate officially declares a winner without question. And then 2 weeks later from that day, you have the inauguration of the president and the vice president. All right. Again, that's January 20th. Now, that date is set forth by the 20th Amendment to the Constitution. Okay. That's why it's called Inauguration Day. The 20th Amendment also makes it to where January 3rd is the date of when Congress begins its new session. All right. So all of that falls into place. All the puzzle pieces are actually set in. So January 6th is meant to be this very administrative, mechanical day. And believe me, it's not any sort of major holiday or anything of the sort. It's just actually set by the Electoral Count Act of 1887. All right. So when we look back on January 6th of 2021 and why all that stuff was taking place, now you know. That's the reason Congress was meeting on January 6th of 2021. It was to certify the Electoral College votes from the 2020 election. And that's the reason there was a rally on the ellipse of the White House. All right? So now that we have all that ironed out, okay, and now that we can understand why January 6th has some sort of importance in a political, governmental aspect, now we can understand why there was some event taking place. All right? So January 6th is when the president's going to hold this rally on the ellipse right outside the White House there. And it's on this day that he, there's a lot of varying reports as to how many people were there. President wanted to say hundreds of thousands. He's even compared it to the Martin Luther King "I Have a Dream" speech, which, look, the president loves to inflate numbers, okay? It's kind of like, as much as I think Pete Rose was a really great baseball player, Pete Rose had a casual relationship with the truth. If he's talking about his stats or certain stats, I would believe it. But if he's talking about events that happened and didn't happen pertaining to his life outside of baseball, I don't know if I would buy a lot of stock in that. So when the president tells you how many people were at one of his rallies, he probably would say 320 million or something. That every single person in the United States came to see his rally. I mean, let's just be honest here. I'm surprised he doesn't say that there was 6 billion people there. The whole world was there. But anyway, the House Select Committee put the attendance number around 53,000. That's what it put in its final report, and that's the figure that I'm going to use here. Okay? So when the president takes the stage and there's a purpose to all of this. All right? There's a purpose to all of this. And his purpose is quite clear. He wants to make himself as if he was a victim. He's going to say here, and look, the president talks for about 70 minutes. That's about an hour and 10 minutes here. He's going to talk to the people who are there. And he's going to frame himself. He's going to shape the narrative that he was a victim out of a conspiracy. And because he was a victim of a conspiracy and he was the Republican candidate, that people who supported him were robbed of a victory. Therefore, putting the very question of a legitimate election in place. Of course, he'd been saying that now for about 2 months. A little more than, about a month and a half or so. So, when he's going out there for that 70-minute, I guess you want to call it a speech, he reinforces all of those things. And look, there's links. I mean, you can Google DuckDuckGo it, Yahoo search it, whatever. His speech, you can find the video out there. You can watch the whole thing if you like. But he tells them that they're going to stop the steal. And how he hoped Vice President Mike Pence would, quote unquote, do the right thing while they're doing the certification. And what does do the right thing mean? Well, in this context, according to the president, doing the right thing would mean that he, being Vice President Pence, would stop the certification. That he would somehow stop it, send the certifications back to the states, and then the states would be able to recertify in some manner. And if he did that, if Vice President Pence did that, then President Trump and Vice President Pence would somehow win. You really got to scratch your head and wonder, what on earth are you talking about? I mean, let's also know that the president, in the past month and a half or so, had been really working the phones and working everybody in Congress to essentially steal the election. I mean, he was caught in a phone call. It was recorded. It was made public, where he called the state of Georgia's Secretary of State, named Brad Raffensperger, called him and asked him, or I guess you could say told him, to find 11,780 votes, because that's one more than how many votes Biden beat Trump in Georgia. So just find him just one more vote. That's all. I mean, that is without question trying to steal the election. That's actually with evidence. You don't need to have any sort of deep analysis or have any sort of forensic evidence with this. You don't need to do that. I mean, it's quite simple. So the president has all these people around him who are just flat out sycophants. Like, they just want to be around the president. They want a seat at the table, so they will tell him exactly what he wants to hear. I can just hear now, can I do that? Can he just do that? And then you got these goofball people who want to be taken seriously saying things, oh, yes, sir, he sure can. Oh, yeah, he can do that. No, he can't. Being a sycophant does not make you a good advisor, and only wanting to hear from sycophants does not make you a good leader. I think that needs to be said and repeated several times. But these baseless claims that the election was stolen, that everything was rigged, the deep state was out for him, the media, really hammered him and didn't treat him fair, and just whatever type of malarkey that can be thrown out there was thrown out there. And that was the president's goal. That helped him achieve his goal. And that goal was mainly to have about 2,000 attendees to feel despondent, angry, and fearful. And those attendees, with many others, marched to the other side of Pennsylvania Avenue and later attacked the Capitol to stop the certification count. Now, I need to be fair here, as fair as I can. The president does say in his speech that he wanted them to peacefully and patriotically march to the Capitol to protest. I know what peacefully means. I have no idea what patriotically means in this context. I have no clue. I would not be able to. I mean, it's just another description to inspire. That's all he was really trying to do here, is wanting the people to feel like that they're doing this for the right reasons. So, just throw out the term patriotically out there. Tell them that they're patriots for doing this in my name. I guess. But when it comes to the First Amendment, and when it comes to peaceful protests, and it comes to these sorts of things, you have to look at Supreme Court cases. And so we have to be able to understand what types of speech are protected and are not protected. Because we have to be clear here, folks. The First Amendment has limits. And so there's a couple of cases that I think are very important for us to understand. And one was done in 1963. It's called Edwards versus South Carolina, where the Supreme Court in this landmark case distinguish between protected peaceful actions and violent violent ones. Eventually I'll get this right. Distinguish between peaceful actions that are protected and violent ones that are not. Okay? Then you look at a court case just a couple years later called Cox versus Louisiana in 1965. This established what was called the doctrine of time, manner, and place in regards to protesting and enforcement. Enforcing time, manner, and place cannot be discriminately or arbitrarily used. And believe me, folks, there are a lot of Supreme Court cases that can be cited here when it comes to protesting, when it comes to peaceful protests, what's protected speech, what isn't protected speech, that can be used in this context. But I want to make one point very, very clear. The Ellipse rally that was held on January 6th, that was an instance of free speech and assembly. That's protected free speech right there. Whereas the violent acts that took place on the Capitol afterwards, those were not protected forms of free speech. But we have to make something else very clear here. The intent of the violence was intended. All right, I mean, it's without a shadow of a doubt in my mind. The violence that took place on that day was to stop the certification of the Electoral College count. That would lead to Donald Trump's exit from the White House, and to stop it at all costs. There's just no question. That was the intent of the violence. Jack Smith, the prosecutor that was saying that was going after the then it was the former president over this, was recently said in his testimony to Congress that you don't have the attack without Trump. You don't have the attack with then President Trump. I think there's a pretty good connection with that. I think Jack Smith makes a good point. But I don't think it necessarily constitutes January 6th that day. We'll get into that a little later. Now, folks, what bothers me as a patriot, now I know that term has a connotation. The right, the political right in America has kind of captured that term. Let me tell you what it means to me. A patriot is someone who believes in this country, believes and has hope for this country, and shares the values that are essentially American. Now, everyone has different opinions as to what they are, but when it comes to being patriotic, it doesn't always mean carrying the American flag. You know, there's the old saying, going to church doesn't make you a Christian just as much as me standing in my garage doesn't make me a car. Just because I might have a flag hanging outside my home doesn't mean I'm patriotic. There's got to be action with that. And I have different opinions as to what that could be as opposed to somebody else. But as someone who values the freedom of speech, the Constitution, I welcome that conversation. And so that's, to me, is what a patriot is. And that's what I am. Now, if someone wants to debate me on that, I'll tell you how to get a hold of me later in this episode. But what bothers me about January 6th as a patriot, as a constitutionalist, as an academic, as an American, is that there are people who unequivocally deny any wrongdoing on that day. They absolutely say there's nothing wrong that happened that day. And in their defense, they throw out all the red herrings you could possibly find. Like, I'm reminded of this scene in the 1980s comedy movie called it's a spoof called Clue, where communism was a red herring. This whole thing here, the whole denial, is a red herring. And here's the red herring argument. Nobody died. Well, nobody died, except for Ashley Babbitt. There's a lot of things I can say about that, but then you're taking the red herring bait. I'm not going to do that. But what you're telling me here is essentially this logic, is that the Cuban Missile Crisis, who cared about that? That was such an overblown moment in history because there were no missiles that were launched. That's what you're telling me. Nobody died. You are obscuring the larger truth of this event. You are minimizing the impact of the attack on the Capitol with such a statement, let alone the fact that that statement is asinine. You kidding me? Nobody died. Nobody died. They threw out this red herring of an argument that nobody died. You don't see through it. I mean, I'm sorry. You see through it. You got to go past it. You don't buy that. Just trying to minimize things. Here's another one. Is that the rioters were unarmed. They didn't have any guns there. Didn't have any guns. You know, I've even heard people say that was the worst insurrection I've ever seen. Nobody there with a gun. That is a patently false statement. Now, look, not every rioter who was there had a firearm. I'll give you that. I will give you that. But there were many who were. There were many who did have a firearm. Guns were not the only weapon of choice, though. According to the reports, rioters came, and I'm not just looking at one report here. There's a lot of them. Again, conduct a search engine inquiry. You'll find the exact same things that I found. Rioters came to the Capitol with firearms, tasers, brass knuckles, batons, knives, pepper spray, bear spray. So this whole claim that the rioters came to the Hill, that they arrived on the Hill unarmed, is unequivocally untrue, is 1,000% false. Tell me that they're unarmed. And then I hear this thing about the FBI. I mean, the FBI? I mean, folks, you really got to go down the rabbit hole with this one. Like, you really got to dig deep. You got to follow that white rabbit because it's got the clock and it's late. I mean, you're really going in it here. The FBI. Here's what these defenders that nothing wrong happened there, that January 6, 2021, and the events that took place is overblown. This is what they say. That the FBI incited the riot. And they were actively involved throughout the time. Again, folks, no evidence of this. Zero. How do I know that? Because the Department of Justice did its own investigation of this and found nothing. They found that informants were there, FBI informants were there, but none of them were authorized or ordered to fight or to enter the building. None of them. So this whole thing about the FBI started it, that it's somehow a Fed surrection, is 100% false. That's a bunch of malarkey. Again, just grasping for straws is all these arguments are. Grasping for straws, folks. And then I hear this thing, well, the FBI let him into the building. No, they didn't. That wasn't the FBI. Capitol Police showed up, and they saw that they were outnumbered almost 100 to 1. They were going to stand behind those barricades. And then they realized they were vastly outnumbered, and then they left. Well, there was someone who was showing them around. There are some reports to suggest that that person was acting as a decoy to get those people away from the U.S. Senate. Like, why is the actual facts being just incredibly obfuscated here? I don't understand. And then here's another one. There's another key argument as to why January 6th is no big deal. It's the whatabouts. What about? They would rather live in whataboutism land than actually, reality. So here's what these defenders of the attackers will say. They'll bring up, well, what about Black Lives Matter, Antifa, summer of 2020, all the riots that took place there? Well, okay. While this is easily sidestepping and just going, if when you're falling down, you don't push your opponent to the ground or to the floor or on the mat. You just let them just keep flailing. Keep rumbling, stumbling, you're going to fall. That's usually what I like to do whenever these people bring up the whatabouts, because I just roll my eyes and just say, that's stupid. And I tell them why they're wrong. But here's what you have to know. So what about summer of 2020? What about all those things? While those protests, those violent actions were different in nature, because they were. January 6th was there to stop the Electoral College count, was to stop the certification, was to stop a political process. Those who were protesting in 2020, in that summer, late spring, early summer, were doing it because of the murder of George Floyd. Again, these are basic things. So you have two different protests, you have two different actions in nature. But let's also know this. Criminals still existed, because Black Lives Matter and Antifa weren't necessarily the only ones who were doing this whole looting and smashing of buildings and blowing up stuff. You had criminals take advantage of this. And those criminals who did those things were arrested, were charged, were tried, were prosecuted, and many were sentenced. There are others that charges were dropped. That's also true. So they were charged and arrested just like the people in January 6th. So whenever they bring this up to me, well, what about that? When you know the facts, when you know what happened, and you understand the consequences of two things, you easily respond back to, what about them? I often just like to say, okay, you want to live in whataboutism land, I'm going to live in reality. Because I'm not talking about those things. They're two different things in nature. False equivalency. So, look, those are usually the things that I hear when I talk about January 6th, whenever this whole thing gets brought up. Oh, that's no big deal. It's no big deal. President even called it a day of love. He said it was a day of love. And how do I know this? Because he was at a town hall in Florida for Univision in October of 2024. There was an undecided voter who flat out asked him. He said, look, I voted for you in 16. I voted for you in 20. I don't know if I want to vote for you again because of what you did and didn't do and all the other aspects about January 6th of 2021. I'm giving you an opportunity to win my vote back. Please explain yourself. And here's what the president said. He said a lot of, he does this whole meandering thing. People call it the weave. It's more or less just he just forgets what he's talking about and then picks up later. But then he goes on to say that it's a day of love. I don't know where the love was. Maybe it was when he was on the stage. Maybe that was the love. Because the rioting that took place shortly thereafter, there was no love there. They weren't going into that building saying, guys, I love you. Let me give everybody a hug. You gotta be kidding me. But regardless of how false and easily refutable these arguments are, they remain popular in the MAGA movement and with people who are close to the president. I mean, look, we saw them on display in the 2024 campaign. President Trump referred to those criminals as hostages. And on his path to return to the White House, the president promised to take clemency actions for those serving prison time for any instance that was related to the attack. Folks, this included those who were there for the most serious felonies, like sedition, the leader of the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers. They were in jail for about 20 years on sedition. That's why I don't call January 6th an insurrection, because nobody was really charged with that. I call it acts of sedition because people were charged and tried and convicted of that. So that's the words that I use. So you had those who were serving time for sedition to the very minor ones who were there for misdemeanors. He promised to take clemency action. And in case you may have forgotten what clemency means, it means showing grace. President has clemency powers. He can give a reprieve. He can commute a sentence, and he can do the pardon. On the first day of his second term, President Donald Trump did exactly that for about 1,500 criminals. He either commuted their sentence to time served and now they're free to go, or he pardoned them. Because according to him, they were hostages. You really got to think about the type of verbiage here. But 5 years later, it needs to be clear that we are far from a shared understanding as to what happened on January 6th of 2021. Far from it. And it's mainly because of misinformation and disinformation from people who just don't accept what happened. Steve Bannon, Alex Jones, all these far-right goons who just absolutely say nothing was wrong. Nothing took place. What? I guess we remember a different January 6th. Maybe they remember a January 6th of 2022. Yeah. scratch my head. But you would think that after he took all of those election conspiracies, all of those things, all those instances, all those legal arguments, he took them to court, and he lost. Not once, not twice, but every time. Logic would tell you that if you took it to court and you never won a case, it's over. But even then, he continued to insist that the election was stolen. Continued. I'm old enough to remember last year he said, guys, we're going to have this big evidence. I'm going to show you the big evidence that the election was stolen. I got big evidence for you. And then he canceled it because he didn't have it. You know, I think his name is Dinesh D'Souza, had this documentary, quote unquote documentary. It's more like a mockumentary. I mean, Spinal Tap. This is Spinal Tap 1 and 2 are more accurate descriptions of a band than this guy's stuff. So he had this mockumentary called, what is it, 1,000 Mules or something like that, where he actually had to recant almost everything that he put in there. He said it's all based on fact, all this stuff. And then the people who he cited in there actually made public statements to say that's wrong. That didn't happen. Again, you don't have to take my word for it, folks. Do an inquiry on your best search engine. You can find it. That should have just absolutely disgraced this guy. But now they have their own echo chamber, and that echo chamber, folks, is called PragerU, where they continue to say that, well, that was contested, and even though Joe Biden was called the winner, we don't really know if he was. That's a bunch. There's a word I want to use here, but I'm not going to. But it's just a load of malarkey. Donald Trump had a choice to make. He could either accept the fact that he lost in 2020 and try to unite the country, get behind Joe Biden, say, he's the president, I'll help him in whatever way that I can throughout this transition. He could have laid down the swords and just say, look, we fought hard, I lost, it's over, let's move on. Or the other path was of denial, delusion, distortion, division. Those are really the only two options that he had. Trump made his choice. He made the people who voted for him and support him just froth at the mouth to be incredibly volatile people, to say that there's no way this guy lost. No way. I mean, it's one thing to take these things to court. But it's another thing to just say, you know what, we went to court and we never won a case. That would be game over. Look, I know about losing. I get reminded of that almost every day. Someone will send me something somewhere to say, well, you lost. I know. I've accepted it. That's part of my history. And I'm fine with it. I'm okay with it. But I've moved on with it. The president had a choice, just like Vice President Gore had in 2000. Now, you may remember this. Vice President Al Gore in the election of 2000 is going up against then Texas Governor George Bush for the 43rd presidency. Bush is going to win the state of Florida by 537 votes. We're talking like, millions of votes being cast here, and Bush is going to beat Gore in Florida by 537. That is a half of a percent of a tenth of a percent. I mean, that's really, really close. You don't get much closer than that. Gore wins the popular vote in 2000. But those 25 electoral votes was really going to be end all be all. All right. Gore challenges the Florida elections. Okay. Goes to court because there were reports and there were instances, and they were very much recorded, and then there was very much a lot of evidence to suggest that ballots that were cast were not counted. That the intent of the voter was very much made clear, but they weren't counted. And so Gore's argument was count the votes, because those people, I know more of them voted for me than voted for Bush. Now, he didn't say the last part, but you can understand why he would do that. That's implied. Bush's argument throughout the entire time is, hey, this thing's over. And to Bush's credit, he acted like he was the winner. Gore kept saying, hey, look, we have to keep moving on here. We have to keep pressing on. And there were times when they won at the state level to count the votes, and then it went up to the U.S. Supreme Court in December of 2000. And the U.S. Supreme Court, in a 5-4 decision, and the case is called Bush v. Gore. The Supreme Court essentially argues that there's not enough time to count the votes in order for the certification. So they said stop the count. Now, many years later, one of the Supreme Court justices who retired in 2005, and let's call her Sandra Day O'Connor because that's her name, was asked about this in interviews and everything else, and she eventually will say, we shouldn't have taken the case. I don't know if she was part of the group that wanted to hear the case or not. We may never know that, but but they did. And when the Supreme Court made its ruling, Al Gore comes out and says, while I disagree with the ruling, I will accept it and I will respect it. And I congratulate George W. Bush on his victory, and I will help in whatever way that I can to unify this country, and I will help him with the transition, and so on and so on and so on and so on. He chose a path, and it's the right path of character, of leadership. And Al Gore, on January 6th of 2001, Al Gore presided over that joint session of Congress, over every single state and their electoral college votes. And he presided over his own loss. So did Richard Nixon in 1961. People forget that Nixon was Eisenhower's vice president. From 53 to 61, Richard Nixon was the vice president. He runs for president in 1960. He loses to Kennedy. Nixon could have done the whole thing that Trump did. To Nixon's credit, he realized that there's no way that he could really win this thing. And so he chose the path of institutionalism. He chose the path of trying to unify. He conceded. Gore conceded. Hillary Clinton conceded. Kamala Harris conceded. John Kerry conceded. John McCain conceded. Mitt Romney conceded. Bob Dole, George Bush, Dukakis, Mondale. How far back do we have to go? But when it came time for the president in 2020 to say, I thought we won. Looks like we lost. I wish President-elect Biden all the luck in the world, and I'll help with the transition. He could have done that the next day. Could have done in the next 48 hours if he wanted to. But the president chose the path of despair, of desperation, of division. Because he had a bunch of sycophants around him to say who had no spine whatsoever to tell truth to power. And then later you hear, you have Bill Barr. Was it Bob Barr? Bill Barr. No. Yeah. Bill Barr. William Barr, there we go, comes out and says there was no widespread voter fraud in the 2000 election. I'm sorry, in the 2020 election. There was no widespread voter fraud in the 2020 election. I mean, that didn't make the president happy. But you had people who, for some reason, kept this conspiracy alive. Kept the flame going when all the president had to do was just say, look, okay, I lost. This country is more important than myself. The institution of the presidency, the institution of this government, democracy, the core aspect, our Constitution is more important than me. But he didn't do that. He did what he always did and chose himself. But had he chose the path of unity, had he chose the path of character, had he chosen the right path, the correct path, Americans probably would have been spared the violence of January 6th of 2021. There wouldn't be this deep-seated anger that comes around when we talk about January 6th. Or this deep sense of frustration about what happened that day. This wouldn't exist. The country needed leadership that day. The country needed leadership prior to that day. And the one who was to give it and is way different than the one who gave it. Because the one who actually delivered that day, the crowd wanted to hang. And I'm talking about Vice President Mike Pence. Vice President Mike Pence at the time showed more courage than anybody else in the White House. But I need to say this. As an American who loves this country, and folks, I do. I value this Constitution and the institutions and the hope and the opportunities and the freedoms and the diversity that this place is meant to welcome. I celebrate those things. The evergreen lesson of January 6th is when we choose division over unity, anger over hope, desperation over opportunity, the consequences are profound. And that's my 5th anniversary take on January 6th. Now, how do you transition from that to talk about Indiana University? Well, the only way that you know how is just to go into it like this. So, I've had, my family likes to make jokes about me. My brothers think it's pretty funny, and it was, and it still is, that I spent a lot of my time in school. I enjoyed going to school. I enjoyed learning. I enjoyed being challenged. I just enjoyed it. So I spent a lot of time going into debt, if you want to think of it like that. And so, I graduated from the University of Evansville in 2006, and UE is really my home alma mater. It's really where I'm truly an alum. I think highly of the University of Evansville. I think I'm forever a Purple Ace. I then have a transition in life. I have this moment where I went back, and so I get another bachelor's degree from Indiana University, and it's a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science. And I was there from 2008 to 2009. And I remember when I was paying the tuition, there was a portion of that asked me if I wanted season tickets to the IU football game. And you always giggled at that because of how much it was. The tickets to the season tickets to the IU football game, folks, $70. 70 period 00000. Add that on. Yeah, I said, yeah, sure. Now, at that time, IU football was really bad. And so, they're just trying to give these tickets away. And I lived like maybe a mile away from Memorial Stadium, and they may have won like, maybe 3 or 4 games. There's just not a very happy time. The best game was always the last game when they played Purdue. And there was a time when Purdue was like a really good football team, but it wasn't this time. Neither. So it was a really fun matchup to see those two play. When you look at the history of IU football, they hadn't won the Big Ten title, like outright on its own, since World War II, since 1945. They hadn't won a bowl game since like New Year's Eve of 1990. They've been in bowl games. There were some halfway decent teams where they would win like 6 or 7 games, but they weren't the powerhouse that they are this year or that they were last year. So here you have a new coach, changed the culture, first ever Heisman winning football player in Fernando Mendoza, and they're just fun to watch. Now they're going to have a rematch here, and I think it's called the Peach Bowl. That's a fun title. Against Oregon. Now when IU had to travel to Eugene, and they play the Ducks up there. They beat them by 10, and that is when I knew that IU football was for real. I mean, just a week before, they just demolished a ranked team called Illinois, and then they go to Oregon and they win a big road game there. I go, okay, all right. This team is for real. They had that last second catch by Cooper in the end zone at Happy Valley against Penn State. Probably the catch of the year in all of college football. And then they go on and beat Ohio State in the Big Ten Championship. They hadn't beaten Ohio State, folks, since 1988. Like, at all. For most of my life, I turned 44 this year. For most of my life, they've never beaten Ohio State. So here they do, and this is a great year. Now, what made it that way? Yes, the coaching staff is a big deal. I don't want to downplay that. But I think it's also the NIL. I mean, that's the big thing that has leveled the playing field out here in West Texas with Texas Tech. Texas Tech has had a very strong and colorful history, going to bowl games, winning bowl games. And, it's not like that they, won these like a Pop-Tart bowl. I mean, what the heck is that about? Why does Pop-Tarts get a bowl? Whatever. But that said, Tech has had a very good history of getting into pretty decent bowl games and doing pretty well. I don't know what the record is I don't know what Tech's record is in bowl games, but I'd imagine they've won more than they've lost. But that is what has been Tech's biggest equalizer, is the strong alumni that Joey McGuire, who's the head coach, has been able to really to rally to get them the practice stadium, the Womble, I think Womble Field or Cabo Wabo, whatever. And to get these name, image, and likeness NIL contracts with these athletes. All right. They'll be there for a year. They might go to class. Who knows? And I think NIL has had a pretty big influence in also IU getting these players there. Because, the question is, do you want to win? Sure. Now, there's going to be naysayers out there who's going to say, well, IU only played Ohio State once. And look, the Big Ten has become a big mass. It's now nationwide. It goes from the West Coast to the East Coast. You got the old Pac-10, Pac-12, Pac-10, except for two schools, and then you have old Big East schools like Rutgers and Maryland. Maybe that was an ACC school coming into the Big Ten. Big Ten was meant to be a Midwestern conference, just like the Big Eight, just like the Southwestern Conference was meant to be more of Southwestern places. The Big 12 is meant to be a Southwestern conference. Geography doesn't matter anymore. But these naysayers would like to say, well, IU didn't play Michigan, didn't play Ohio State, didn't play. And then you have some naysayers for Tech who will say, well, they're only dominating because UT and Oklahoma are out of the Big 12 and are now in the SEC. Come up with whatever excuse that you want. If Kirby Hocutt, who is the AD, the athletic director for Tech, they want to get into a contract with UT or Oklahoma for non-conference games, go ahead. But you make sure they come to Lubbock, because Tech's had the better record. Yeah. Just face the fact here. Well, they don't have to play the schedule that UT does. Do you think UT and Oklahoma left the Big 12 for the SEC for competition? No, they left it for money. That's what it comes down to. That's why A&M left the Big 12, because they didn't want to be dictated to by UT and money. That said, is the Big 12 a weaker conference than all? I'm not getting into that. This isn't a sports podcast. But what I will say is this. Tech's future looks pretty bright. IU's its present, looks really good. And I think with this coaching staff and his ability to recruit and the strong alumni, you're going to get good NIL. These NIL contracts is a game changer. Now that paying players is legal, there's 1980. The 1980s and SMU is looking at this going, come on, Southern Methodist, really? But I'm cheering on IU. I never thought I would say that, because when you grow up in Indiana, you kind of like IU, but here I am, like being forced to like IU. I'm like, no, I don't like IU anymore. So I had a little Saul of Tarsus on the road to Damascus type of a feel here. So I'm like, yeah. So I have 2 bachelor degrees, one from the University of Evansville, another one from Indiana. And then in 2009, I went to Rhode Island and got my master's in political science from the University of Rhode Island. Go Rams. Right. But you gotta, if you're in Lubbock, you're in West Texas, you have to admire Texas Tech, and so I do. So it's a pretty big campus, very, very beautiful. So is my employer, South Plains College. So I should mention here that my opinions are not necessarily shared by those of South Plains College and the faculty and the administration and the board of regents and all those people there. So don't think that this is somehow my employer is endorsing them. They're not. This is just me doing this out of my own free will and accord. I needed to say that, needed to throw that disclaimer in there. All right. Folks, thank you for listening to the Outsider Podcast. Folks, you can find the Outsider Podcast on Facebook. You can go like and follow it there. Find it, you can find it on, find me on Twitter, Instagram. All right. Also, like and subscribe to us here, me here on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify. Also, be sure to subscribe to me on Substack, where you can find this video, and also on YouTube. All right. Thank you so much for allowing me to entertain part of your day. I'll see you again very, very soon, and have a good rest of your day. Thank you.